know exist. Take a perk and talk it and see. Money swallowed like sis. Then it perfected the kid. Got a billion who take on my hate. Let me better put on the road I just spit. I know we got $1 million. The devil that shit ain't not cheaper again.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Manga Muse. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the first part of What If Naruto Joins Avatar Last Airbender. Special note, this fanfic is written in a masterpiece of Blutus Mindpretzel on fanfiction.net. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. 12 days before the arrival of Sazen's comet, Azula woke in her cabin, the sweat clinging to her body a striking contrast to the calm she felt in her heart. She sat up, reality and memories reminding her of where she was, traveling to Boiling Rock Prison at the behest of her father alongside Ty Lee, in order to interrogate prisoners over the potential whereabouts of the Avatar. She sat up in bed looking over the dimmed cabin that she resided in while aboard one of the capital airships and realized her heart was pounding as well. Ignoring it, she stood and walked to her wardrobe, letting her evening clothes fall away as she prepared to change. The cool air felt wonderful against her skin that still glistened with sweat from what must have been something of a fitful rest. As Azula gestured with a finger and caused every lamp in her cabin to burst to life with a piercing blue glow. She reflected on why her body had been in such a state after she had woken up feeling just as fine as any other time she had risen from sleep. There was no dream she could remember. She didn't dream anymore as it was. A fever perhaps? No, she truly felt fine. There was a knock at the steel door of her residence and she looked to it without a word, wondering who would be foolish enough to try and rouse her. Captain is wondering if we're flying straight to the prison or stopping at the dam for refueling and resupplying. As Ty Lee's voice echoed in her ears, Azula shook her head. Of course it would have been her, entirely unafraid of one of the most formidable and frightening people in the entire Fire Nation. I'll be on the bridge in a moment. Fortunate then that her body had unintentionally awoken her though as Azula listened to Ty Lee's ever-valiant steps prance away. She couldn't help but notice how ragged her voice had just sounded. Adjusting her ornamental hairpiece, she stared at herself in the mirror. She looked to be everything she was, striking, fear-inducing and powerful, and it was this image that allowed her to wave her hand and douse the lights before exiting her room and marching towards the bridge. The uneasy feeling she had been feeling disappeared soon after. Where am I? There were very few things he knew for certain as he attempted to resuscitate his consciousness. He was on his knees with his wrists bound and stretched to his left and right, rendering the majority of his body incapable of moving. Some form of blindfold had been laid over his eyes, ensuring that all he saw was a perpetual black void. And if all that wasn't worrisome enough, a numbness that seemed to originate from the back of his neck told him that he was being paralyzed on top of everything else. How did I come to be here? Whatever drug was being injected into his system was keeping the reality of the situation terribly out of reach. He couldn't remember names, places, or much of anything beyond his own name. The only part of his being that seemed to function appropriately beyond the ability to open and close his eyes were his ears, and they picked up quite immediately on every distant echo that sounded around him. Wherever he was, it was built of steel and iron as the cold hardness beneath his knees attested to and the groaning echoes of his holding chamber perpetuated. Their volume and long rumbles told him that his chamber must also have been very monstrous in size. Above him came the sounds of heavy and powerful equipment, though it must have been from quite far off. Why can't I remember? It might have been hours or days or even weeks before a heavy clang sounded somewhere within his prison, and he might have tensed had he been able to. Another clang sounded shortly thereafter and silence returned before the soft padding of footsteps nearing him caved in the lack of sound. The idea of unknown figures approaching and being as vulnerable as he was drove another unpleasant stake into his mentality. At last, voices began to sound around him, the first being nasally and commanding in nature. What you are about to see is of the utmost confidentiality. Being a new chief penal officer, you are about to enter a small group of individuals who know this part of the prison exists, as well as its contents. A softer and more amenable tone replied, I understand, Warden. The steps drew closer. You were sent by the capital to Boiling Rock with what information precisely? Only that the prison required more attention than ever and was at a greater risk of potential escapes than ever. The steps stopped as the voice belonging to someone known as the Warden shouted in response, wrong. Potential escape attempts. Prisoners do not escape Boiling Rock Prison. I apologize, Warden, I meant no disrespect. This was simply what I was told before I was deployed here. A deafening pause sounded before the steps continued. Pardon my manners, Chief Officer, but the previous invasion on the day of Black Sun has put most of the nation on edge. Confusion mingled in the voice of the underling. Forgive me, Warden, but shouldn't that have bolstered the confidence of the military and the Fire Nation as a whole? The Avatar himself assaulted the Fire Lord's private residence on the day where we firebenders are at our most vulnerable, and still we suffered very few overall casualties. The Warden growled before replying. Perhaps, but prior to the invasion, no one would have even thought an invasion feasible. Not only were our shores breached by the enemy, but said enemy were able to reach our Lord himself. Yes, it was a failed invasion, but now an invasion is known to be possible. What's stopping the Avatar from conducting a raid on the capital again, or on any of the districts, or perhaps a prison? The emphasis on the last word was not to be missed, and the officer took the hint. I suppose you are correct, Warden. I always am. Now, while I attest that this prison remains unbreachable and untouchable, an incident occurred only recently that stands as the true reason you and a fair number of elite soldiers were sent here. The footsteps drew to a halt at a distance the prisoner could only guess as being feet away from where he knelt, bound and helpless. Only a week before the invasion attempt, the Fire Lord visited the Temple of Sazin for a long bout of private meditation. A common practice during times of war, I've heard. HMPH. A waste of time in my mind, though I'm sure our Lord Ozai has more reason beyond that for his extended departures from the royal palace. But that is beside the point. One pair of footsteps began to slowly pace in a wide loop around him, and the direction of the voice that followed told him the Warden was the one circling him. Supposedly, though much of this is hearsay, as what actually happened was only witnessed by the Fire Lord himself and his personal guard. In the main hall of Sazin's temple, a black cloud appeared. The pacing continued and he closed his eyes in frustration. Though the blackness remained, performing one of the few motions he was able to was ever so slightly relieving. And through said black cloud, this boy appeared. He stepped into Sazin's temple and immediately assaulted the Fire Lord with a powerful array of firebending. Firebending. Despite whatever skill and power he holds, he was supposedly delirious and clearly exhausted, and our Lord Ozai and his personal guard were able to subdue him. He was then sent here and placed in this very lower cell of boiling rock. For a moment, the only sound was that of the Warden's footsteps as he arced around him before the officer spoke up. I regret to say I am confused by this story. Warden, an assassin makes an attempt on the Fire Lord, and he is brought here instead of being interrogated and killed in the homeland. The Warden chuckled, a low and awful sound. I'd be surprised if you weren't confused by the situation, Chief Officer. But there are a few answers to your query, though most remain speculative at best. Firstly, do you know why this chamber was built? It was designed and constructed to hold the Avatar upon capture. The steel bindings and chamber would be the best way of deterring his bending, and the paralysis needle that remains implanted in his neck would keep him helpless even further. Correct? Now I will tell you what has been passed through the grapevine to reach us, though I encourage you to take it with a grain of salt. It is all speculative at the moment, but where we have placed this prisoner indicates there may be some truth behind them. That being, the first speculation infers that, whilst engaging the assassin, several of Lord Ozai's guard actually turned against him and their fellow guard. They ceased their act of betrayal after the perpetrator had fallen and claimed that after looking him in the eye, they had seen that Lord Ozai and the rest of the guard had been decoys set as a front. Now, Lord Ozai had little mercy for such an act and killed all of them on the spot. But if you look at our prisoner here, his eyes are covered. Correct, bearing credence to at least part of the rumor being accurate in nature. The second rumor, however, is less established, and much more impossible than some potential hypnosis technique. I'm listening. While engaging our Lord with firebending, this boy broke the rule of nature that we have accepted as truth for thousands of years. He not only employed firebending but also airbending against the Fire Lord. That is impossible. Only the Avatar can utilize any more than one bending of an element. Again, this is only hearsay. We can only act on the order of the Fire Lord, who has ordered this prisoner be attended to as one of exceptional dangerous potential. I understand, Warden. It is my belief you will never have to even enter this chamber again. Only the chief penal officers, the elite guard, and myself even know this area has a prisoner. It will stay that way. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Warden. I have been made aware that Her Highness, Princess Azula, will be gracing our walls in the following days. The Fire Lord himself has made it known that he does not want her made aware of this prisoner. There was some audible fear in the officer's voice as he replied, "The princess is coming here." Indeed. Have you any reservations about that, Chief Officer? Another lengthy pause followed by a meager, "No, sir." The steps resumed again and echoed more and more faintly until 2 more thunderous clangs rebounded through the chamber, leaving him to reflect in harrowing silence on what he had heard and to twist motionlessly in anger that he still couldn't remember a thing. Letting out a grunt of pain, Zuko recoiled as the guard's fist slammed into his stomach for the umpteenth time. "You'd better be ready to talk by the time the warden gets back." Zuko's head snapped to the left as another shot from the guard sent stars bursting across his vision. "You didn't just show up here dressed as a guard for no reason. You have co-conspirators, a plan or something else up your sleeve, you damn traitor." Another strike to his gut and Zuko had to keep himself from retching. In the deep part of his mind that wasn't currently battling the pain he was being subjected to, there was a humorous irony that he, a Fire Nation prince, was currently being beaten for information on his co-conspirator who happened to be a member of the Southern Water Tribe. Oh, how the tables had turned. As the fist pulled back again for another hit, Zuko decided to at least earn his beating a tad. "Maybe if you actually hitting me instead of poking me with a wet sock, I might be more interested in talking." There was a shout of anger and Zuko allowed himself a quick smile before his world exploded in another burst of black pain and he nearly was knocked into unconsciousness. As his world swirled and tried to steady, the door to his cell was wrenched open with a wrenching creak. "You, the warden specifically sent me down here to make sure the prisoner was ready for him, and I find you bludgeoning him half to death." Somehow, the phony tough guy voice that Sokka was employing made his appearance next to the guard 6 times his size even more humorous, and Zuko croaked out a laugh. Said massive guard turned to look at him with furious confusion before returning his look to Sokka and jabbing a finger in his direction. "He's a traitor. The warden would understand." Glancing carelessly back out into the hallway up and down as if expecting to see the warden coming their way, Sokka looked back to the guard. "Oh, I see, he'll understand. Why don't I just go get him and then you can explain that to him and why it's perfectly acceptable for you to break his rules." At this, the guard swallowed audibly and backed away from Zuko. "There won't be any need for that." Nodding matter-of-factly, Sokka jerked a thumb over his shoulder and barked, "That's what I thought. On your way." His immense size barely allowing him to fit out of the cell entrance, the guard plodded off, muttering darkly to himself. Sokka watched him go before closing the door and sighing wearily. "I'm sorry, you don't deserve this." Managing to right the world, Zuko gave his head a shake as every part of his body ached. "No, that one I deserved." Sokka gave him a confused look before adjusting his helmet. "I think we have ourselves a halfway decent plan, but we'll only get one shot at it. I'm figuring the best way to kick off a prison riot. If we can manage that, the warden and his head officers will hide on top of the command tower until the situation gets under control. We sneak up there, take him as a hostage and ride the gondola out of here. They won't cut the wires if we have him aboard." From where he stood chained to the wall, Zuko tried stretching and felt his bruised torso groan in protest. "Not bad. Suki come up with that one, or was it your dad?" Fixing him with narrowed eyes, Sokka made a face underneath his helmet. "Hardy har har. Just because my first plan didn't come through, doesn't mean all of my ideas are terrible." He paused for a long beat before adding, "Mostly my dad's idea." Zuko leaned his head back against the cold wall of his cell and closed his eyes. "Yeah, I thought something like that." He heard a few cautious steps and opened an eye to see Sokka peering at him worriedly. "You don't look so good. Are you going to be okay to make it out of here?" Furrowing his brow, Zuko leaned forward. "Relax, Sokka, I've had it worse than this. As soon as it's time, I'll be ready to move." "You sure?" Leading with an angry growl, Zuko couldn't keep himself from snapping. "Look, I just had a long visit from my ex-girlfriend who put everything she had into making me feel like the most awful person on the planet. I've been beaten like a slave more than once since we got here. I can't stop thinking about my uncle and what might have happened to him. And on top of all that, Ong and everyone are probably going crazy trying to figure out what to do about us and this stupid stunt we've pulled. I just want to get out of here as soon as we can." Zuko stopped there to take in a breath after digging into all the most prudent points that warranted mentioning. He knew how childish it was to keep complaining, but in that moment, it was all he could think to do. What came next was something he had not been remotely expecting. "I'm sorry, Zuko." He looked to his companion to see Sokka's eyes pointed downward and his hands fidgeting nervously. Clearly this was something he was having trouble getting out. "You're in here getting the crap beaten out of you because of me. I know you're just trying to help everyone, and after what you did for Katara and Ong, you didn't need to prove yourself to me. I guess there's always going to be a part of me that resents you for what you did. But that can't stop me from accepting you in the now. I know you've been hurt, and you've had to make just as many sacrifices as I have. And I'm sorry if it ever sounds like I'm belittling that hurt." Zuko felt something in his gut that wasn't pain starting to swell. It was something that only Uncle Iroh had ever made him feel, and he realized that he might have even appreciated Sokka in that moment too. Of course, showing too strongly that he felt that wouldn't do. "Sokka, your sister is showing." At once, his companion straightened and smiled sheepishly. "Yeah, I guess she would be there. Sorry about that." He turned to leave the cell and Zuko immediately regretted what he had said. "Hey." Sokka turned in the doorway and looked back inquisitively. "You don't ever have to be sorry to me." "Not ever." There was a long silence between them before Sokka looked away and pounded his fist gently on the door frame. "Tomorrow afternoon. Be ready." In her time traveling with him, Katara was pleased enough to admit to herself that she had very rarely seen Aang truly upset. From saddened to furious, they were not emotions he was often willing to completely succumb to, and more often than not, a good talk or some time alone was usually enough to get him back on the straight path. Not that she could blame him for any emotional outburst he might have stifled. There was more than a bit of weight and pressure on his shoulders, and at such a young age, he had handled it extremely well and had taken setbacks in surprisingly good stride. Most of the time. "I don't believe this. How do we not notice Sokka and Zuko flying a giant, stupid war balloon out of here? How do they not tell us or think to even ask us if we think it's okay?" Aang shouted furiously as he paced intensely back and forth. Katara watched him carefully as she tossed a glance back towards where the rest of their companions were sitting down a set of massive stone stairs. Toph, the Duke, Tio and Haru were likely all silently hoping to catch what was being said, but they didn't likely want to so much as come near Aang right now. Katara too was quite upset by the turn of the situation, but keeping Aang in check needed to be her main priority right now. "Aang, try and stay calm. I'm sure Zuko wouldn't have gone through with him on this if they didn't already have a straightforward and reliable plan set in place." He turned to face her, his large eyes angry and wild. "A straightforward and reliable plan they didn't want to tell us." Katara winced. It was a fair point. Aang turned away and looked out across the chasm facing away from the air temple that they were currently hiding out in. He spoke again in a much more controlled voice, but there was no less distress in his tone. "When you and Zuko went to go find the man that killed your mother, I stood back and let you go. I knew that one way or another, it was something that was going to eat at you until you faced it." Gently and slowly, Katara walked up behind him to look at the setting sun that dipped over the other side of the chasm. "It was," Aang continued, "but even if I wasn't happy about it, you still took the time to tell me what you were doing and why. You still bothered to tell everyone how you felt and why it had to happen." His tone began to swell again and Katara clenched a fist silently at her side, hoping in her heart that this wasn't going to be something that she needed to intervene in for the safety of Toph, Haru, and everyone else. She hadn't expected to succeed in the desert outside Ba Sing Se, and she wasn't sure she could prevent it again. But as she prepared herself, all at once the fight seemed to drain from Aang and he dropped down to sit cross-legged with his hands underneath his chin. She didn't need to see his face to know how badly he was hurting. "I know Zuko is still learning to trust us, just like we're learning to trust him," Aang murmured sadly, "but for Sokka to do this, and not even mention it, what if something happens to them?" Feeling her own absolute anger over the situation storming in her gut as well, it was all Katara could do to maintain a calm and composed edge to her voice, one that she hoped would bring Aang some semblance of peace. "We have to trust that what they're doing is right. If they find Dad, then they'll get him out. If not, they'll come back to us just as quickly." He didn't say anything and she lowered herself next to him before putting a hand on his shoulder. "They've been gone over a day. Katara, the Boiling Rock is only a few hours' ride from here. Maybe they needed a day to put their plan in motion." When he only sighed as a response, Katara felt something close to frustration clawing its way up in her insides. Aang couldn't be blamed for his feelings on what Sokka and Zuko had done, but she needed him strong right now, more than ever. "Do you want to go after them?" He looked at her in surprise and she stood, looking down at him intently. "Well, do you think it would make their situation better if we just flew in on Appa, going crazy with our bending? You don't think we'd be putting more at risk if we did that?" Realizing where she was going with this, the life went out of Aang's eyes and he looked back forward, dejected and defeated. "Katara, please." "No, Aang, please tell me how you would have us deal with this. All the times you went off on your own, when Sokka and I were with fever, when we lost Appa, when you flew off after you woke up from the coma Azula put you in, every time you gave us no choice but to trust you." He didn't say anything in return, and she dropped down next to him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You have to trust Sokka and Zuko now. They will come back and they will be okay." For a moment, she was sure that he was going to shut her out again, but he spoke up quietly at her words. "I know. I guess I knew that the whole time. I just thought we'd finally be a point where everyone could just be open with everyone else. I hate not being able to help, or at least offer to. It's like they knew we'd try and stop them or something." Hearing him open up was something so completely fulfilling that for a long moment Katara couldn't respond. He's growing up. She sat down next to him and pulled him to her so that his head rested on her shoulder. Probably, but you know what? They wouldn't have done that if they thought we didn't care. Ong shook as he exhaled a single laugh. For a while, they sat against each other, watching the sun set, and Katara couldn't help but feel at peace herself with the situation even despite her own front that she was putting on for him. Slowly, she could feel herself believing her own words, and she looked up at the sky in peace. Before a pebble zipped into the side of her head and bounced into Ong before clattering away against the stone floor of the temple. Katara put a hand to her head in pain as Ong mirrored her movement while snapping angrily, "Toph, what was that for?" Behind them, the girl in question sat on the shattered remains of a broken pillar, kicking her bare feet carelessly. "Oh, don't mind me. Just wondering what we're going to do about your jackass brother and angsty prince daddy issues." Katara felt herself pushed as Ong got to his feet and directed his gaze angrily towards Toph, and she felt her heart sink. Perhaps she hadn't gotten through to him at all. He took a deep breath and stared her down furiously, and spoke a solitary word. "Nothing." Katara snapped her head to look in shock at him. Ong continued to stare resolutely towards Toph, who inclined her head in similar surprise. "Nothing." He didn't back down. "We have to trust Zuko and Sokka to do what they think is right. Even if we're not happy with how they handled this, there is nothing we can do that won't put more at risk. I know you're mad, and so am I, but for once, we're going to stay out of it." Katara was sure that this about to turn into a full-blown argument, as she had never seen Toph back down from an argument when she was sure she was right. But rather, Toph simply cocked her head at Ong and shrugged. "All right," and she walked back down steps she had come towards where the rest of their small band sat around a small fire. Katara watched her go, and Ong spoke quietly next to her, voice rich with disbelief. Did Toph just choose not to argue? Tilting her head slightly in his direction, Katara whispered, "You know, Ong, of all the things you've accomplished as Avatar, that might be the single most impressive." They turned to look at each other, and for a beautiful moment, their laughter resounded of the remains of the Western Air Temple, permeating its walls with a sound that it had not heard in something near 100 years. After a while, Katara took Ong by the hand and led him down to join the others around their small fire, trying their best to put aside their fear and their doubt, and to trust in their comrades. And as Ong drifted off on leaning on her shoulder, Katara stared towards the bright, shining lights blinking in the night sky, thinking to herself hopefully and angrily, "Sokka, if this trip doesn't kill you, I honestly might." The night was a cool, tender breeze as Azula looked out over the wide ocean lit only by the moonlight. The blue of everything caused her to grind her teeth in annoyance. So much calm was doing just enough to remind her that at a moment's notice, anything could go wrong. The dragon that was locked in the furnace of her heart whispered to her of all the horrible things that could transpire during the monotony of this voyage. Perhaps there would be another invasion while she was away from the capital. Perhaps Ba Sing Se was going to be retaken during her absence. Perhaps right now, the Avatar and his damned flying bison would come flying out of the glare of the moon, and Azula. It was with a fair amount of self-control, Azula whirled and managed to keep herself from letting loose a firebolt in the direction of the voice. The dragon had roared to life inside of her, going from playing devil's advocate to being ready to aid her in unleashing hell on some newfound enemy. Of course, it had only been Ty Lee who had come up silently behind her, and was in something similar to a defensive fighting stance, as though she had been expecting to be attacked by the princess. Azula turned back to look out over the calm rolling of the water beneath them, cursing the tranquility of it all. "What is it?" Having made her presence known, Ty Lee needlessly did a pair of somersaults to stand next to Azula and leaned on the railing, looking out thoughtfully. "I just wanted to check on you. Usually right about now, you'd be down below, berating the engineers, or the war ministers, or whoever you can find." Azula felt a content smirk slide onto her face. "I was on the lead cartographer about an hour ago. Did you know that he thought it was appropriate to try and update the map in the war room without even so much as asking for my permission or necessary specifications?" Ty Lee bit her lower lip for an extended pause before asking, "Did you kill him?" Turning her eyes to the acrobat, Azula narrowed her eyes. "I don't kill every subordinate who fails in their duties." Ty Lee rocked back on her heels as she leaned over the rail. "Maybe not, but that ratio sure isn't pretty." This was something Azula could agree on, but she found the statistic more reassuring than anything. It reminded her the importance of keeping those beneath her in order and served as a constant reminder to all of what could come of failure. "Are you worried about Mai at all?" Pulling a face, Azula turned her gaze down towards her, the youngest member of her team, in annoyed confusion as the question came out of nowhere. "Why would I be?" fidgeting with her hands and looking like she was trying hard not to look perplexed. The acrobatic warrior continued to watch the ocean and moonlit sky, not meeting Azula's gaze, and just thinking how fast she took off to Boiling Rock after she found out Zuko was there. It was so sudden, she didn't tell either of us. I don't know, I guess I was just thinking maybe her involvement, if that's the right word, with your brother might lead to some trouble. Fully annoyed now, Azula crossed her arms. I hope you're not trying to suggest that one of my 2 handpicked soldiers would be harboring sympathies towards the enemy. As Ty Lee began to squirm and potentially stammer out some apology, Azula carried on over her. I have no doubts about Mai's loyalty to either the Fire Nation or to me personally. Her desire to see my darling brother will only further cement her position as one of us. Seeing him turn traitor might be a little rough on her heart, but in wartime, she will know not to show weakness. Ty Lee opted to simply nod in affirmative and keep her mouth shut, which Azula found exceptionally gratifying. Of course, Mai would not be so shallow as to want to show mercy towards Zuko, who had abandoned her in the night in favor of allying himself against his own nation and family. Her feelings might be pained, but there was no question of loyalty, of this Azula was certain. Azula, what do you want when this war is over? The question came blurting out of the mouth of her friend so quickly that it was clear she had said it before the courage left her. Azula turned to see Ty Lee staring at her intently. Is that a serious question? Another nod, and those same eyes looking at her with the same fervor told Azula that this was in fact a genuine query, and she sighed. It was such a pointless task, pondering the future when the present required every bit of her attentiveness. Looking ahead and trying to guess at unknowns was a dangerous distraction, one she had been fighting before Ty Lee had joined her on the bridge. I suppose if you must ask, I can't be sure. It depends what the outcome of the war will be, whether Father will want me somewhere in particular. No, Azula, I don't care what the Fire Lord wants. What do you want? Azula stared bemused at her friend, who saw her expression and made a noise of frustration before beginning to pace, spouting off words furiously as she walked. I'm just so worried about you. All you think about it is the war, and fighting, and destroying the Avatar and your own brother. It's like you don't even want to consider a future where you aren't perpetually at war, that you just want to fight, that you can't even think about peace, or love, or anything. She stopped and dropped her arms to her side in defeat. I don't want you to throw your life fighting forever. Apparently content with what she had said, Ty Lee turned away as Azula thought she saw the glistening of tears on her face captured by the moonlight. She strode from the bridge and left the Azula alone again, who stared after her for a long time. Stupid girl, wasting so much emotion being upset over nothing. Why does she care what happens to me? She turned her eyes upward towards the moon and closed them, the soft blue light of it seeping blurrily through her eyelids. Why should she care what the future held for her? In the name of the Fire Nation, she would accept whatever responsibilities fell on her shoulders, no matter how heavy or how many. This was her purpose, her calling. If the responsibility to uphold the Fire Nation became that of burning the southern and northern water tribes from the face of the planet, she would obey. If the responsibility to uphold the Fire Nation required her to marry the most detestable and undesirable man in her eyes, she would comply. Ty Lee could not possibly understand that burden. She who played everything as though it were a game and who only wanted the world to recognize her individuality. Azula knew better. She always had known better. But as she traveled nearer to Boiling Rock Prison, she couldn't help but notice the single sliver of doubt that had wedged itself in the back of her head. The sliver was small, but thin and long, and it only asked her a single question, one that Azula refused to name a subject to. What if? She shook her head and scowled at the night sky. What a ridiculous train of thought. The only things that mattered were service to her country and to her father. She couldn't believe how the rest of the world always seemed so unsure. Like Ty Lee, always questioning and worried. The reality of the situation was always more simple than they made it out to be. It was what kept things from spiraling out of control. Azula, your brother may never understand this, but I believe you can. You must always do what is right by your own principles, however hard that may seem to be. If the whole of the world reviles you as a villain, you must shoulder that burden. If nothing but hate is flung your way, you must allow it to glance off your armor. And if anything attempts to stop you, you burn it to the ground and walk over its ashes. That is the curse we bear. Her father's words once again rang in her head and once again rang with perfect clarity. Azula sighed in contentment. It would taste a lie to say that she didn't care for her father, and for Ty Lee and Mai as well. But that caring was an attachment that could be discarded at a moment's notice if need be. Nothing could prevent her from making the choices that needed to be made. There was nothing to come between her and her curse. The darkness had grown more oppressive, though he wasn't sure exactly how long it had taken for it to achieve this level of grievance. Not being able to feel the majority of his body was one thing, but being unable to so much as see his surroundings as the prison clanked and rumbled around him was nothing short of maddening. But still he tried to remember. There wasn't much, truly there wasn't. Not a name, not a purpose, not a single face he could picture to spur memories of where he had come from. He knew that he was strong, there was that. And he knew he had a purpose, a very particular and important purpose. But as he struggled in the dark, desperate for even the barest glow to grace his eyes, nothing concrete came to him. Wait, that was a glow, wasn't it? Even from behind his pitch-black visor, he could see something glowing a faint, but intense blue color just from the bottom of his vision. It slowly increased in power, ramping up to where he knew what he was seeing was not his mind's eye playing tricks on him before his blindfold was swept from his head with a sudden and striking movement. At first, it was only pain that engulfed his vision as the blue glow before him came fully to bear on his eyes that had been seeing only black for some time. His vision blurred with pain tears and he closed them, trying to recover. You have arrived in this world as an anomaly, traveler. Unable to look away, he opened his eyes to see that the causation of this harsh blue illumination, and the low and powerful voice resonated from the same source. A man stood before him, garbed in simple but important-looking robes, long white hair, and beard indicative of his age. But the eyes that stared into his and the very stature of the man before him were enough to enforce the idea that age was of no great consequence to this visitor. The ghostly specter continued, "How I can stand before you and speak to you in a way you can understand, I do not know. But the spirits have deemed you of great importance if they seem to necessary to pull you into this world." The prisoner felt a great wave of frustration as he desperately tried to form words to hurl his questions toward this man. Questions that didn't feel they could wait. As if by some providence, the man before him answered one of them. "I can sense your confusion and your lack of memory, no doubt the latter being a byproduct of your sudden emergence here. But your name, I know it to be Sasuke Uchiha." A name he knew was right, a name that he couldn't believe had escaped him. Moments ago, he would have given his soul for a wretched name, and now he had one. He started to see flashes in his head, images, faces and moments all strewn about in a tangled clutter. Sasuke shut his mind off from them, knowing that trying to delve into them all at once could scramble his brain much worse than it already had been. The Blue Haunt continued, "I cannot tell you why you are here as my understanding of your purpose is nearly as restricted as yours. But the world has need of you, has pulled you into its arms and I cannot go against the world I protect." Sasuke tried to stare down the glowing blue shadow before him, but found it to be very difficult to maintain a look into its eyes. The nations of this planet are in conflict. The forces of the Fire Nation and its Lord Ozai work to oppress all others, and the only thing that stands between him and fulfillment of this plan is the Avatar, a great warrior who may be of use to you and you to him. Above Sasuke and his ghostly advisor, there came sounds of a great ruckus as though hundreds of people were screaming all at once and running about in chaos. "This is where I must leave you. Element, I could not be of more help, but I can only implore you heed my words and seek out the Avatar. He may be different from you, but you both may benefit from one another's strength. If the Fire Lord falls, I believe answers will become clear. There is a great power I can sense in you, and one way or another, I believe this world will come to taste it." And the light faded, leaving Sasuke in semi-darkness and alone. Who was that? That was all he could manage to think towards the form of a man that had just visited him. Someone who had come and gone like a breeze. Someone who had known his name and had freed his eyes through some ethereal means. Would have liked to no longer be paralyzed though, being able to look around his chamber as much as he could with his head being stuck in place. He could see that it was indeed a giant steel cavern of sorts, long and winding pipes snaking over the walls and ceiling which peaked a couple dozen meters above his head. "It's all I have now. Find someone known called the Avatar and start working towards answers." The symphony of discord above him continued, and added to the yells and pounding seemed to be the sound too of muffled explosions. Before Sasuke could do much to try and rationalize those particular noises, a wrenching metal clang echoed across the walls of his chamber as red light flooded into the room. A door had swung open in the ceiling ahead of him, revealing a spiral staircase that opened onto the vast metal floor that was his holding cell. Pounding their armored feet along the steps, a group of soldiers came filing swiftly down the stairs, the voices of some of them clashing with the echoing of their footfalls. "Did the warden order us down here? It doesn't matter if he did or not, the rules are absolute. In the case of a level 3 or greater emergency, we are to watch the prisoner until said emergency has been handled. The prisoners are running loose above us, and we're supposed to watch the one that can't move. Orders are orders. Spilling towards him is a wave of red-clad guards. The men circled Sasuke, who remained motionless on his knees, arms pulled away from him with wrists still bound in chain that tugged away at him into the gloom. They closed in around him cautiously, and the man who must have been in charge barked out an order. "Seal us in." The red light faded as the door closed again, dousing the room in relative black before an orange glow erupted to life behind Sasuke's field of view, and scattered conversation picked up in low, alert tones. "Stay tight, everyone. I'm sure they'll have the situation contained soon enough. I heard Princess Azula arrived this morning. Think she might have something to do with this. I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest. I heard she ordered the sinking of one of the warships after a captain talked back to her. Any crew who made it off in time were pulled aboard the sister ship and made to fight to the death. She's psycho. That was never confirmed. Now shut up. Both of you, we're not being paid to speculate." A brief spell of silence followed before one guard took a step back and bumped his foot into something solid that went sliding a foot or so away. "What was that?" "I don't know, my foot hit something." The man who replied turned and knelt next to Sasuke, who saw him reach down in front of where Sasuke knelt to pick something up. As it was lifted, it looked to be some sort of metal band with straps attached on either side. Wait, wasn't he supposed to be? As the guard looked from the blindfold to meet Sasuke's eyes, and there came a flash of instinct that would have been nearly impossible to ignore. The guard's mouth slacked and he wobbly straightened. In the direction he was facing, the man who had sounded to be in charge spoke harshly. "What's the matter with you?" There was the barest pause before the man in front of Sasuke gave a howl and lurched forward, balls of fire blasting from his palms and fists all over the place. The room exploded into a frenzy of raw heat and bright flashes, and Sasuke felt more vulnerable than ever as the shouts sounded around him, complemented by the snaps and thuds of the fire. Then, something seared just past his neck and he flinched at the intense heat. I flinched. He had indeed, and a simple long breath told him that a fireball had severed the cord pumping him with that paralyzing liquid. Feelings slowly beginning to spread to the far reaches of his body, and he grunted as he flexed blood back into his arms. He heard bellowed orders to get the rogue guard under control as he inhaled and exhaled several long times. Words leapt to the tip of his mouth, summoned by that same instinctual flash he had felt when looking to the guard. Fire, release, incinerate. Being able to hear his own voice was almost as gratifying as feeling the heat intensify around his wrists, as his cuffs fell away to smoke and smolder. The man who had looked him in the eye had been taken down, and the rest of the guard had caught on to the fact that their sole job was now rising to his feet, unfettered. The man in charge sported a more ceremonial-looking mask and pointed at Sasuke. "Take him down. He must not leave the room." Fire swirled from the hands of the soldiers, and ever so briefly, Sasuke could see something very akin to fear and disbelief running over their faces. He had no time to decipher their concern, however. He was more than ready to depart this hole in the ground. His hands flashed with motion as he spoke words dredged from his subconscious, lightning illusion flash pillar, leaving his supposed captors flinging fire blindly around them while they clutched their eyes and howled. Sasuke leapt deftly to the stairs, avoiding their askew attacks and preparing one of his own. As he reached forward, and a huge fireball of his own blew the door of his prison clean from its hinges, tearing the floor around it to pieces, one thought echoed in his head. Find the Avatar. As a man who could have snapped her in half if she kept letting him race her way barreled towards her, Mai swiftly moved to the right to sidestep him and threw a knife into the back of each of his knees. With a howl, he came crashing to the ground, and before he could make another noise, Azula dropped out of the sky next to him and scorched the life from his body. Hands still being licked by blue fire, the princess eyed Mai playfully. "Not getting slow, are we?" Another rampaging prisoner came thundering past them, chasing after a pair of much smaller and more terrified-looking inmates. Mai eyed him briefly before letting fly a single knife that buried itself in his back. He dropped without a word, and within an instant of him hitting the ground, Ty Lee came somersaulting over, used his body as a spring, and landed 2 mid-air kicks on the other 2 rioting prisoners, putting them down just as swiftly. She touched down and rolled over to them briskly, and the 3 looked over the courtyard that still was soiled with the results of the prison riot. They stood on a higher wall that overlooked the courtyard and gave them a good view of the tower as well. Mai could see her uncle on the walkway that surrounded the tower, no doubt screaming order and trying to remedy the situation. She was just as content to let her relative deal with the mess. Only one thing really was mattering in her head at that moment. Azula looked out over the chaos and smiled. Truly, this may be a blessing in disguise. Half will kill the other half off, and the prison becomes much more controllable. Mai flicked the princess an annoyed look, and then the entire world hears word that Boiling Rock is less a prison and more of an adult playground. No more legends of its security or fear or its walls. Pish, no one cares about a prison anymore, not with the war winding to a close. Azula intoned carelessly as she lit blue pockets of flame beneath her feet and rose gently into the air. Prisoners are just leftover garbage that society tells us we can't throw away because it's bad for the environment. Walking over and pulling her knives from their victims, Mai didn't look at her old friend. Torch the trash then, is it? She could feel Azula's cold eyes burrowing into the back of her head. Of course, why wouldn't that be the best course of action? Mai didn't say anything, though she immediately wished she had thought up a lie of some kind as Azula made a noise of mock surprise. Oh, how foolish of me. My darling brother Zuzu is locked in here, right? And you wouldn't want him hurt, would you? Flipping gracefully to land in front of Mai, Azula stared her down, all pretense of her fake compassion gone. He's a traitor, Mai. Worse than that, he's an incompetent traitor. He declares himself against the Fire Nation, flees the capital, and what happens? He somehow gets caught here of all places. Still biting her tongue, Mai walked to stand by Ty Lee as the Fire Nation heir stalked after her, taunting all the while. I'm sure you went and saw him since you beat Ty Lee and myself here. Did you find any clarification? Any reasoning on why he didn't even think you worth telling in person that he was defecting and dumping you? Oh, I'm sure dear Zuko just had plenty of things to say. Ty Lee turned to give Azula a disapproving look. Come on, Zula, cut it out. She of course did not. Tell me, Mai, did he even say sorry? Did he even pretend to still care? Something tweaked in Mai's temper and she spun on her heel to close the distance between her and Azula. Superior firebending though the princess had, Mai felt a rush of cold satisfaction that she stood taller by several inches. It felt good to look down on Azula, who so rarely had anyone do such a thing to her. Alright, Azula, you want to do this right now. Fine. Zuko actually did say sorry. He apologized for hurting me and for lying to himself because he wanted to be with me. He's hurting more than you can guess, not that you'd care, and you know why. Because he gives a shit about other people and what they think. He did what he thought was right, and even though I hate him for what he did, I think I can forgive him anyway. Clearly surprised to be spoken back to, Azula blinked for a moment before narrowing her eyes and jerking her chin sharply in Mai's direction. And why might that be? Mai leaned in. Because I still love him. For a long moment, they stared one another down, dares in their eyes for the other to make a move. Mai felt that she actually saw a wisp of blue fire around Azula's fingertip before Ty Lee, who had momentarily been forgotten along with the roars and ruckus of the riot beneath them, shouted while pointing wildly. Zuko. In unison, the pair of them snapped their gazes to the acrobat, and Mai ran up to grip the railing tightly, staring over the carnage of bodies and hurled fire. Where? She followed the direction her friend was pointing in, and with a rush in her gut, she saw Zuko with two other people standing on the walkway that her uncle had been shouting orders from moments ago. He was still up there, but had been subdued by a young woman that Zuko was with. For a moment, her temper flared violently. And who might she be? The other person, an older waterbender by the looks of him, flipped a guard over the walkway and gestured for Zuko and the girl to follow him, and they complied, carrying the struggling warden with them. Mai couldn't make out the words they were saying, but they could have been speaking gibberish for all she cared. Zuko was alive. Azula was already on top of the situation with her usual prowess and cold efficiency. They're planning on riding the gondola out of the prison. They'll use the warden as a hostage to make sure we don't stop them or cut the wire and drop them. Ty Lee turned to face the princess. How do we play this out? But before Azula could reply, a strange blue glow began to resonate beneath them. Mai looked down to see what was causing it, thinking that perhaps Azula was generating a massive amount of her blue fire beneath them. But that was not the case. The glow was coming from beneath the floor and was expanding to a diameter of at least a dozen feet. Several of the warring prisoners and guards had taken notice and had backed off in likely hope of some kind of self-preservation. The blue light flashed then in a glinting explosion, and the metal floor of the courtyard's base erupted outward, sparking lightning in all directions and tossing aside those unfortunate enough to be near it. The metal was torn outwards and curled aside to open a hole well wide enough to accommodate a crowd of people. But one mere figure jumped from the now smoldering crater and landed lightly around the mixture of rioting prisoners and soldiers who had come together to stare in bewilderment at the newcomer. At once, 4 soldiers rushed him, both with weapons raised and fire spewing from their clenched fists. The young man waited until they were right on top of him before seeming to suddenly be above them without having moved at all. His feet came down on the heads of 2 of the men, bashing them into unconsciousness on the floor before he leaned into the third, grabbing the man's spear and forcing it into the chest of the 4th. The impaled soldier toppled, and the third dropped his spear in shock at the speed it had been redirected with before spinning to life a whip of fire. The tongue of flame lashed through the air, but the figure seemed to weave in and out of it, fire collecting around his own hand. As he reached the flailing and final attacker, the flame exploded through the man's torso as the prisoner extended his hand to touch him. Seared and destroyed, he collapsed, and the figure touched the ground almost exactly where he had been before, now surrounded by 4 downed soldiers. Impressed, Mai gave a slight nod in the figure's direction. "Who's the guy, Azula?" The princess shook her head once, eyes alight with suspicion and confusion. "I have no idea. I went over the prisoner manifesto 3 times on the trip over, and other than the Kyoshi warrior girl, there was no mention of someone so young." Ty Lee had a broad smile on her face as she leaned over the railing to get a better look. "Or so cute." Both Mai and Azula gave her an exasperated look, to which she only shrugged guiltily. Azula rolled her eyes and returned her attention to the situation at hand. "Ty Lee, go after my brother and his little party of escapees. Plug them all up, make sure they won't be going anywhere." The acrobat nodded in affirmative and began to head towards the tower before looking back, eyes wide with curiosity. "What about the both of you?" As though whatever animosity had been grinding between them had disappeared, Azula fixed Mai with a hungry smile. "What do you think about introducing ourselves to our cute newcomer?" Mai shrugged and felt for the handles of her knives, making sure she was fully equipped, while sarcastically replying, "I suppose you're calling dibs on him." To her surprise, instead of responding in turn, Azula's cheeks flushed as she snapped, "Why ever would I do that?" With a slight sense of satisfaction and humor in her heart, Mai shrugged again. "Never mind." As the last of his attackers fell onto the steel floor with a crash of armor, Sasuke looked around at the dozens of onlookers, daring them to advance. None of them, not prisoner or masked guard, seemed willing, and Sasuke took stock of this as he began to flick his eyes around, trying to guess at the fastest way out of this prison. Save for the couple dozen assorted men watching him, fights were still running rampant past them and all around, and he imagined that escape before this riot ended would be most preferable. It was then that he heard a door squeak open behind him, and out of the corner of his eye, he watched a guard with armor that looked outlandishly too large for him, looking like he was trying hard to be relatively inconspicuous. When he saw that no one was paying him much mind, he began to scoot around the outer wall in the direction of the main tower, muttering to himself, "Looking good, looking good. And won't everyone be happy to see I brought them all presents? Katara probably will chew me out for wasting time on this, but when one of these babies saves her in a pinch, that would be so sweet." Sasuke noted that the guard was also carrying a few weapons under his arm, a short pike with a hook on its reverse end, a long sword that looked almost ceremonial in nature, and the last weapon was a short, straight sword of no particular note in a black scabbard, and while anyone else might have ignored it, Sasuke froze for the shortest moment. "That's mine." It was all he could think before he took a step towards the lone guard who hadn't noticed him. Somehow, he knew that sword belonged to him, and if there was anything he knew for certain, he was going to act on it. Or at least, he would have, had he been able. A flaming orb of a bright blue splashed at his feet, bursting out like a flower of some hellish origin. The guard carrying the weapons elicited a very peculiar squeak and dashed away, his unobtrusive act left by the wayside. Sasuke turned to see a young woman dressed in royal garb and wearing a very ravenous expression touch down a fair distance from him. Behind him, another young woman dropped, looking equally upper class but dressed much more relaxed. She seemed more at odds with being there, but there was no denying the cold steel in her gaze. Ahead of him, the more restless-looking woman addressed him, voice loud and smooth across the courtyard. "I don't suppose you'd be willing to tell me what you're doing here, since I have a strong suspicion you don't belong amongst these degenerates." Slightly relieved to have someone who was at least willing to talk, Sasuke also noticed, however, that the courtyard quickly cleared of all other people, prisoners and soldiers alike. The guard who had made off with his sword had vanished, but one thing at a time. "You'd be correct. I don't know how I came to be here, but I intend to leave as soon as possible." Her constant and ardent smirk was anything but reassuring. "Only the most dangerous and important prisoners wind up here at Boiling Rock. I'm sure your stay was not made without warrant." A gently glimmer in the hot sun told Sasuke that the woman behind him who hadn't spoken had weapons drawn. He tried again to be somewhat diplomatic, but his impatience with the situation was rising. "I'm not here for a fight." He decided to be relatively honest, not a tactic he liked, but if these women knew the man he was looking for, it would speed up his search tenfold. I'm looking for someone called the Avatar. I believe he and I can help one another. The words had barely left his mouth before he realized this had been a poor choice of words. The woman's smile transformed into a look of raw fury and she propelled herself into the air on azure flames. As Sasuke felt the sullen woman behind him tense, the one bearing down on him snarled furiously, "Another traitor. You will burn alongside my brother." Sasuke exhaled in soft exasperation as teeth of a broiling blue inferno closed around him. Narrowly avoiding a knife that swept past his ribs, Sasuke attempted a grab at the arm of the sullen young woman trying to slice him open. But to his surprise, a brisk show of speed put her well out of his reach before he could even begin the movement. He only had the briefest moment to acknowledge his failure before a scorching missile caught him in the back, searing painfully before his chakra flow dispelled it from dealing further harm. Chakra, that's right, and my Sharingan. His instincts and movements were becoming recollections as he recalled words and teachings from what seemed like eons ago. Turning to face the flame-wielding young woman, he found himself quickly assailed by a flurry of hurled sapphire spheres that blasted apart whatever they touched, from the ground to the walls. His Sharingan allowed him to slip around them, though he nearly missed the woman's companion who slipped past the flames just as easily and sent 2 sharp jabs at his face. Tensing, he leaned back, focusing chakra in his feet to keep himself rooted, and as she reached him, he was able to take her by the wrists and kick her over his head. He only had time to see her roll to her feet in a swift recovery before a tendril of fire snapped into him and sent him crashing to the ground. As he skidded a good dozen yards, he took his momentary respite to take stock of his foes. This world was still very foreign to him, but if there was one thing he knew for sure, it was that he knew strong opponents when he saw them. Both of the young women were about his age, and just as well trained as he was in their respective arts. The more aggressive of the two as far as fighting went, the flame-wielding one had a powerful grasp on her skills and while very zealous with her attacks, there was a fierce control about her that told Sasuke she didn't place a fireball except exactly where she meant to. She continued to advance on him with a pretentious and avid smirk that told him she was also fully enjoying every attack she sent his way. The other was much more reserved but no less skilled. She would wait for windows to attack when Sasuke was focused on avoiding the other's offensive, and she never missed a single one, applying a constant pressure that made getting any sort of real breather near impossible. Save for this very moment where he picked himself slowly up, Sasuke wasn't sure he had been able to stop moving during their entire engagement. As they neared him and he saw them tense for another onslaught, he decided to probe a bit. If he could buy enough time, he knew his eyes could help him acquire what he needed from the both of them. "So, this Avatar isn't a friend of yours, is he?" Fire crackling around her wrists, the first young woman fixed him with a repulsed sneer. "Are you trying to make some kind of joke, or are you just stupid? The Avatar is everything the Fire Nation needs rid of. He gives hope to the weak and delays our permanent rise to power all the while. All in the name of some stupid sense of morality and stubbornness." Straightening, Sasuke cocked his head while feeling the vague memory of a stupid, smiling face slip through his mind. "Funny, that reminds me of someone I think I knew." The woman's eyes narrowed to slits. "You can take that humor to the grave." Sasuke wasn't ready for it. All that time, he was certain he had seen the maximum speed and cohesion they could offer, but they had duped him perhaps the entire time. Coming in very near the ground, the knife wielder rose in the blink of an eye to leap over his head, striking downward with 2 knives. Sasuke batted one aside, but the second sank into his shoulder almost to the hilt. The pain was much less of a surprise as the fact that she had actually managed to hit him. But then the first woman threw a flaming sphere the size of a small boat at him, forcing him to leap away to avoid it. But this only led to the second woman, who was still in the air, to drive her feet down into his back and sending him skidding into the ground once again. On his hands and knees, Sasuke saw something pitch black and swirling in the corner of his eye as he grit his teeth behind tight lips. "If these two keep this up, I might get mad." But no, Amaterasu was not necessary, nor did he want it to be. If Sasuke had preferred, a taijutsu beatdown mixed in with some regular jutsu would likely have been enough to put these two in their place. But he also felt that time was not on his side. This would be quicker, and some small vile part of him told him he might enjoy this. Slowly standing, he raised his hands in another attempt to be diplomatic. "I don't want to fight. This time, he saw it coming a mile away. These two women were not the type to squander an enemy having their back turned. They both came on full force and he used his chakra to feel them rushing ever closer before turning at the last moment, eyes flashing red. You did this to yourselves. Zuko scrambled on his hands and knees to the edge of the cliff, battered and injured and in no state to fight any further. He looked over the edge, hundreds of feet down into the raging sea below, as if contemplating hurling himself over the side to escape her. Zuzu, it didn't have to be this way. Azula paced towards him, the last remnants of what she believed to be love falling away as she steeled herself with raw purpose. Her brother looked back at her, eyes wide and a hand raised pathetically as if to stave off what would be the finishing blow. Looking down at him, Azula raised her hand as Sazan's comet passed above them, the world around them being consumed in flame. Goodbye, brother. And as though she had been waiting her whole life, she brought her hand in a sweeping arc and with a shout of conviction, she cut down the last thing between her and finality. Above her and the corpse of her brother, she saw her father's airships laying waste to the entirety of the Earth nation, turning their pathetic stone barriers and walls to molten slag. Her father himself was likely near to finishing the Avatar off. If he hadn't already, Ozai had told her that he would wait until Aang activated the Avatar state before killing him. With that, there would be no successor to the young man and the Fire Nation would reign supreme forever. Azula threw her head back and laughed at the scorched sky, relishing the heat that roiled around her, gripping every part of her tightly in its embrace. But she wasn't laughing. After a moment, she realized she was crying. And not just quiet tears, but real sobs were racking her body, painful and overwhelming. Her breathing came in jerking and uneven intervals as she fell to her knees, the same fire she had been embracing now crashing against her and with a restrictive and terrorizing grip. She couldn't be sure why she was crying until her hands fell over her brother and she gave a yell of shock and fell away from him. Her heart pounded as she stared at his body. Did I do that? Why are you crying? She rolled over in shock at the voice that seemed to echo all around her. As she clambered to her feet, hands raised in preparation to fight this newcomer, she saw that she was alone on top of cliff, no one to be seen. Still, the voice persisted. You achieved that final goal you've been striving towards for years, and now you lapse into despair. Is it regret? Azula spun, eyes flashing wildly at the sky and the ground, desperate to put a face to this oppressive voice that almost seemed to be inside her ears. Where are you? Show yourself. Even to her, the voice that usually was nothing short of commanding and purposeful sounded to her to be on the edge of breaking. She hated how she sounded, but she also was having trouble gathering the strength to care. Don't you dare hide from me. I am heir to the Fire Lord, the ruler of all 4 nations. The voice was a despicable level of calm and controlled. The only one hiding here is you, princess. Hiding from yourself and your true feelings, and from the fact that you've been nothing more than a tool your whole life. Screaming angrily, Azula drew up a cyclone of fire around her, and blew it out from her in all directions. This invisible instigator would not be able to hide from that. And she blew out a relieved breath as she wipes her cheeks free from tears. You have nothing. The voice sounded directly behind her and she turned in a panic to see the prisoner from Boiling Rock staring at her with a flat, impenetrable stillness. Shocked he hadn't been destroyed by her attack, but thrilled she could finally see him, she loosed a flaming bolt towards him. It passed directly through him without leaving the barest mark. You are nothing. Generating a blaze of fireballs above her head, she dropped them towards him and they combusted in a wild burning tempest around him. But when they flame and smoke cleared, he stood untouched. He took a step towards her. All the ones who cared for you have died or left your side. Your father will abandon you like a craftsman would do to an obsolete device of no further use. Feeling her body howl in protest at the sheer force required to create it, Azula pulled to life a firestorm around him and directed it inwards, and the resulting explosion shone as bright as the sun. He remained unscathed and took another step. You will be left behind, unloved and unneeded. Nothing but a shadow. Azula raced towards him in a last-ditch effort to silence his words, gathering intense heat around her forearm. It blazed and formed into a tight glove of energy, pointed at the tip of her fingers to become a spear of torridity, and she launched it at his chest, fully expecting it to pass clean through him as though he were just the same as the smoke that filled the sky. Azula felt her heart skip as her improvised weapon contacted his chest and sank right through him. She looked up to his face with glee, furiously excited to see him die. But she saw not the hard stare of the prisoner, but the pained face of her Uncle Iroh. He reached weakly for her face and she felt his rough hand caress her cheek as tears leaked from his eyes. Azula, I'm so sorry I couldn't be there for you. I wanted to help you and Zuko so badly. She blinked in utter disbelief and pulled her hand from her uncle's chest and he dropped to the ground, breathing in a rattling and unstable way. I didn't want your help, she muttered weakly, but fresh tears stung at her eyes. Her uncle gave her an agonized final look and whispered his last words. I love you, Azula. No, wait, no. IROH. Azula heard herself shout as his eyes glazed and his breathing stopped. She fell to her knees again and put her hands over his body and realized how badly she was shaking. I wasn't. Behind, the prisoner spoke. You could have saved him. From the ground, she turned to see him still staring at her with those eyes, those damned eyes. She could see now a red pattern in each of his pupils, mesmerizing and hellish. Seeing no other recourse, she crawled the few feet between them and bowed her head. Please, stop this. As her tears blurred her view of the ground, the reply she received was anything but sympathetic. You who are without mercy, without humanity, now reduced to what so many of your victims were. Sensing a vast, looming presence, Azula turned up her gaze to see that the stranger had disappeared, but above her in the sky, two massive orbs peered down at her, red holes with sinister patterns gazing down at her, judging her and condemning her. Closing her own eyes and completely surrendering, Azula rolled over and put her hands over her face. She cried then, openly and completely, wondering how it was that she could have come to this. Sasuke looked at the two women whom he had places under Genjutsu. On both accounts, he was surprised by what he had seen. The woman he now knew to be named Mai had been possessive of a fair bit more compassion than he had expected, and subjecting her to the torture of the people closest to her had been more than sufficient to drop her into a momentary state of agony. She was on her hands and knees, quietly pleading with some unknown captor to stop hurting her boyfriend, or the other of the three girls he had seen, or Azula. Now this had been interesting. He had seen no immediate relationships he could torment her with, and nor could he see any real fears until he found something behind the last place he could have thought to look, concealed behind her ultimate drive and motivation. Her desire to completely win this war she was wrapped up in was a true and absolute fear that she would be entirely destroyed by the resulting consequences. On the surface was teeming hatred for her brother and uncle, yet he saw her crumble when confronted with their deaths. She came across as a hardened warlord, but when stripped away, she was an emotionally stunted child. She writhed at Sasuke's feet now, these nightmares plaguing her waking conscience with their cursed images. For a moment, Sasuke forgot about his own goal in the now, why he had placed the two of them under Genjutsu. Find the Avatar. Both Mai and Azula had exceptionally strongly willed minds, and without knowing how to actually subject them to Tsukuyomi, he was already starting to feel drained at the effort to keep them in his illusion. Chakra seemed to operate differently within them, as though it was more simple, yet much harder to combat. As though their very existence provoked the idea that chakra was less a part of them, and instead, there was something else. Tsukuyomi. Where have I heard that before? He knew of the technique, what it did, but where had he seen it used? Scowling at the uselessness of trying to recall that what so eluded him, he dragged first Azula and then Mai to rest against the back wall of the courtyard. They had attacked him, but he had no interest in having them be killed by rampaging prisoners. He felt he knew what happened to those of royalty and privilege when an establishment collapsed, and these too might suffer grave consequences if they were found before his Genjutsu wore off. Leaving them out of sight and out of the way, he looked at the tower and the walkway that now only held a couple bodies, none of them moving. Focusing his chakra flow again, he ran directly at the wall and sped up it as though it were parallel to the ground below him. Within seconds, he had scaled the tower and touched down on what seemed to be a platform occupied by a gondola station. Suki, come on. Directing his sight towards the voice, Sasuke saw the same guard who had run off with his sword, now free of his mask, attempting to operate the gondola controls. Bodies were strewn about the upper pad of the tower, all appearing to be soldiers and guards that had been subdued or killed. He could also see a few figures shadowed and already on board the gondola, and the only ones not amongst that number and were still standing were the guard who had yelled, and two young women who were engaged in a furious bout of hand-to-hand combat. One was dressed in what Sasuke had gathered was standard prisoner garb and was having to fight on the defensive, though putting up quite the fight of her own. The second girl caught Sasuke off guard though, as he had seen her not moments ago in Mai's illusionary world. She fought with a vigorous and smooth style, and seemed to have most of her offense focused on making short, sharp jabs, likely to try and disable her opponent through pressure points. She also seemed to be enjoying the bout, though not as Azula had. Rather, this girl looked as though she were partaking in a friendly competition with no real stakes. Ty Lee, if I recall. As if she had heard him speak her name aloud, the second woman performed an acrobatic disengagement from the prisoner, and landed atop the gondola to stare down at Sasuke with wide, intense eyes. Mai and Azula. What happened to them? There was no longer any enjoyment behind her eyes, and she looked more so as though she were about to spring for his throat. Still, Sasuke didn't speak a word, just watched her calmly. He remembered his duel with Rock Lee well enough to know how to deal with a fighter like this if he let her make the first move. Wait, Rock Lee, whose? His confusion nearly resulted in him receiving a violent kick to the head, and he barely managed to move away in time. Just enough to turn what might have been a concussive strike into a glancing blow that still sent him reeling away. When he straightened, he saw Ty Lee only a few meters from him in an aggressive stance, eyes both furious and terrified, and watering with tears. If you hurt either of them, if you so much as touch them, I'll... Sasuke finished her sentence coldly. Cry. With a scream of fury, she rushed him, and he came under the same attack that the female prisoner had been subjected to moments before. She was quick, and more than quick, she was precise. Her movements would redirect with every attempt he made to juke, and he was being forced to dodge outright. There wasn't a great deal of room to maneuver, and she was relentless. Then, as she leapt into the air to come down with a powerful overhead kick, something came spinning through the air behind her and clipped her hip, sending her unceremoniously to the ground. The object continued spinning to arc back around, and Sasuke watched it return to the hand of the unmasked soldier, who then waved with his boomerang. Come on. Realizing both that the gondola was moving and that the guard was addressing him, Sasuke propelled himself swiftly to leap and land where Ty Lee had been moments before. Balancing atop the gondola, he looked back to see Ty Lee on her feet and staring furiously in his direction. She took a step towards the gondola, and Sasuke realized that someone with her skill could probably traverse the wires with ease. Hoping to discourage her, he summoned Chidori to his hand, letting the blue electricity snap and flash around him. She saw this and paused. For a long moment, he thought she would rush after him regardless before she turned on her heel and raced for the stairs alongside the tower. Not sensing that he was in any more immediate danger, he banished the Chidori and swung through an opening on the side of the gondola to confront his fellow escapees. The first person he saw was the guard, who he saw then to be likely no older than him, late teens at the very oldest. Adjusting his armor that still looked absurdly unsized, he put on a large and grateful smile. Thanks for your help back there. Though I've never seen Ty Lee get so mad. He walked past Sasuke and looked back the way they had come before glancing back with a cautiously curious look. You didn't happen to fight Mai and Azula at once, did you? Sasuke felt no need to lie, even to these strangers. With any luck, he would be rid of them as soon as the gondola reached its sister station. I did. The guard stared in amazement. And you didn't die. Holy smokes, I'd count your lucky stars, friend. Before Sasuke could even think of a reply to that, he was grabbed by the shoulder and pushed against the wall of the compartment. He found himself then face to face with another familiar visage, a young man with short black hair, and a violent burn over his eye that had resulted in a brutal scar. He snarled at Sasuke angrily, "Did you hurt her?" The guard, as well as an older man with thick, shoulder-length hair, came up behind who Sasuke knew to be Zuko and gently pulled him back, the former muttering, Hey, Zuko, easy now, don't exactly think we need a fight to break out all the way up here, right?" Knowing full well of the relationship between Zuko and Mai, as he had seen vivid proof of it minutes before in Mai's head, Sasuke shook his head. She passed out, but she wasn't hurt. Just a little rattled perhaps. This didn't seem to calm Zuko's temper in the slightest. What's that supposed to mean? Fortunately, the guard stepped past Zuko in an attempt to calm the situation. Sasuke was grateful. He hadn't been looking forward on trying to explain Genjutsu, and was honestly more sure that he wouldn't have even mentioned it. He didn't know if he wanted letting this world know of his many talents, like his Sharingan and his various jutsu. It seemed clear that this world, whatever it was, had a viable difference in all of the constants that Sasuke had known. Differences in chakra and in jutsu, or bending, as he had heard. Look, we don't need to do this, Zuko. If your girlfriend tried to knock him off, he had to defend himself, right? And he says he didn't hurt her, right? Zuko pointed sharply at Sasuke. And I'm supposed to trust what he says. The guard shrugged helplessly. I don't know what to tell you, buddy. All I know is that we all escaped the same prison. And there's no way to really verify anything he says. Unless you want Chit Sang to throw you back to the prison and check for yourself. In the corner, a man that might have stood 7 feet tall with muscles of absurdly large proportions stood and offered a subtle wave. Zuko spent several long seconds staring Sasuke down before coming to some internal conclusion. Turning away, he walked to another corner of the gondola and crossed his arms, eyes fixed angrily on the ground. Turning carefully away from Zuko, the guard gave Sasuke an apologetic look. Sorry about him. He's had a real rough go of it. Father burned his face and vanished him. He lost contact with his uncle who was the one person who accepted him. He's been doing his best to try and win us all over. Sokka, I'd rather you didn't, Zuko growled from the corner, still not looking up. The young man Sasuke now knew as Sokka winced. Sorry, yeah, me and my big mouth. He scratches the back of his head for an awkward moment before seeming to remember something. Well, anyway, I'm Sokka, like he said. That's Chit Sang, Suki and my dad. He pointed at each of them respectively. Other than the behemoth prisoner Sasuke had already been acquainted with, Suki gave him a nod, but he could read the distrust and suspicion in her eyes. Sokka's father was much more amenable and actually reached out to shake Sasuke's hand. His face was tired, but his eyes glowed with the fire of a warrior. Pulling away after a short, firm handshake, Sokka's father, or Hakoda as he introduced himself, towed the last passenger aboard the gondola, a very vain-looking man who was bound and lying on the floor. I don't suppose you've met the warden. We'll be dumping him off at the other gondola station. But if you have any parting words for our beloved caretaker, now might be the time. From the ground, the captive warden muttered sourly, "You peasants dare address me in such a fashion." Despite whatever skill and power he holds, he was supposedly delirious and clearly exhausted, and our Lord Ozai and his personal guard were able to subdue him. He was then sent here and placed in this very lower cell of boiling rock. While his face was not one Sasuke recognized, his voice surely was. Reaching down, he grabbed the warden by the front of his garments and slammed him against the gondola wall. He stared into eyes that now shone with distinct fear as several voices rose up behind him in shock and protest. Ignoring them, Sasuke bore his eyes into the warden's. How did I come to be in your prison? He didn't feel it would be necessary to raise his voice, and his assumption was correct. The warden began spilling information as freely as if ordered by the universe itself. You were brought in during a routine shipment. You were in a special transfer crate, just like we used to move all our prisoners capable of bending. But I only was made privy to your history shortly thereafter. Sasuke didn't loosen his grip. What history? You told that man that all you knew were rumors. He narrowed his eyes. Do you believe them? The warden swallowed and raised his hands in a sign of surrender. Please, I'm not paid to make guesses on such things. I only maintain the prison and its occupants. Sasuke briefly considered putting him in a genjutsu to test the truth, but he found that he believed the warden. And he didn't want to expose his abilities in front of all these people, especially since they seemed to be intent on letting him live. And on top of that, he still felt drained from putting both the princess and Zuko's girlfriend under. Unbelievable. Just two people were that much of a drain on my chakra. Releasing his grip, the warden dropped back to the floor just as the gondola gave a hearty jerk and stopped. Sokka looked out the door and sighed with relief before returning his look to Sasuke with a cautious edge to his eye. We made it. Let's get off everybody before they come looking for us. Sasuke departed the gondola last and watched them deposit the warden in the empty gondola station before Sokka and Hokuto stepped aside to exchange words quietly. Suki and Zuko joined the conversation and it quickly became heated and tense. Sasuke didn't need to use a jutsu to tell that they were talking about him. Hokuto seemed by far the most calm of the quartet, gesturing peaceably while Zuko looked hellbent on stressing something. Eyes furious and fists clenched. Suki seemed to be pleading with Sokka about something and he said little in reply, risking an occasional glance in Sasuke's direction. After something near a minute of hushed arguing, Sokka finally broke free from their tight circle and walked almost sheepishly up to Sasuke. He looked over at his shoulder at the members of his party who had just been engaging in a fervent debate. Hokuto looked calm, but politely concerned. Suki appeared nervous and Zuko had his back turned outright. Sokka looked back to Sasuke and fiddled with his hands nervously as he spoke. Look, stranger, we don't know much about you, but I do know two things. First, you were locked up, like us, which means you're on the Fire Lord's bad side, which is a plus from us. Second, you managed to hold your own against two of the toughest ladies I've ever run into, which means you're good in a fight. He seemed to almost not want to say his piece for a moment, before sighing and continuing. I don't know what your plan from here is, but if you'd be at all willing, we'd be honored if you would accompany us back to our camp. If you have anything to tell us about your battles against the Fire Nation that might be of use to some fellow rebels, we'd really appreciate it. His eyes lit up. Oh, and we have food too. Sasuke stared flatly at the young man. He wasn't quite sure what to make of him other than that his energy was on a whole different level. But at the very least, he was offering food and shelter, and while Sasuke planned his next move, he would likely be able to make very good use of them for the time being. He had little to tell them by way of useful information. his memory still being deeply impaired, but they needn't know that. Sokka seemed to be getting anxious at the lack of reply, and he nervously shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Suwo, is that a yeah or a nah? Remembering something, Sasuke reached towards Sokka's arms and yanked his sword free, growling as he did, "That's mine." Seeming entirely okay with that, Sokka shrugged. "Yeah, sure, no problem. Real nice sword." Sasuke gave him a look before gesturing forward. "Let's go." Clearly having not expected to have had his offer accepted, Sokka's face lit up into a wide smile. "Fantastic. Alright, we're gonna snag one of the Fire Nation war balloons they supposedly have stashed on the other side of this mountain and take that back. Come on." He bounded away back to his group, where Hokuto, Suki and Zuko fell in line behind him, some more grudgingly than others. Shitsang already was halfway up the hill and was waving them on. For a long second, Sasuke considered this choice he was making. It was very possible that keeping his existence a secret from as many people as possible might be one of his best advantages, but it also happened he was about as lost as he could be in this new world. Perhaps these rebels would have very little useful information for him, but it was his best place to start. Without his memories, without any real knowledge of where to go or where to begin his search, he would have to play nice. Sighing through his nose, he followed his newfound companions towards the airfield. After all, what are the odds any of these people would actually know where I might find the Avatar? With an explosive gasp, Azula sprang upright, panting and looking around frantically. There were no airships, no bodies, no great smoking sky, or massive pair of eyes staring piercingly down at her. She was sitting against the wall of boiling rock prison as the distant sounds of men doing battle touched her ears. For a moment, it was all too overwhelming, as though she had just been shaken awake from the most terrible dream. Putting a hand over her breast and feeling the violent pounding of her heart, that may very well might have been what happened. It wasn't real. It wasn't real. She repeated the 3 words in her head over several seconds before reality began to catch up. Annoyance and frustration began to dig their way back into her gut, and she stood up shakily. Of course, it wasn't real. Stupid of me to think it ever could have been. As if I would ever regret my part in bring peace across the nation. It was just some cheap trick that prisoner used to save his hide. A drug to make me undergo some nightmare perhaps. As her thoughts began to work on rationalizing what had happened, she gradually felt more at ease. Her only regret was that the young man who had tricked her had vanished, likely escaping. If she had him there now, the things she would do to him. "Azula," a cracked voice sounded behind her, and she turned to see that Mai was also sitting against the wall, looking as though she were just waking up. She looked as bad as Azula had felt moments before, though Azula was surprised to see tears still streaking down her friend's face. "Are you okay?" Momentarily perplexed at the question, Azula gave Mai a confused look. "Of course I am, why wouldn't I?" This was as far as she got out before Mai launched herself to her feet and pulled Azula into a fiercely tight hug. Completely stunned, Azula could only stand there as she felt Mai pull in shaky breaths and hold her as though her life depended on it. She said nothing, and didn't release Azula until another voice called out above them. "Azula." Mai, turning to see where the voice had come from, Azula saw Ty Lee looking down at them from the walkway around the prison tower. Agilely leaping her way down, she raced over to the pair of them and threw an arm around each of them, pulling them into a 3-way hug. Starting to become annoyed with these needless shows of affection, Azula patted both her friends mechanically on the back in an effort to speed things up. When Ty Lee pulled away, she too looked on the verge of tears. "I'm so glad you're both okay. I was so worried." Mai seemed to have regained her composure, and her voice had returned to its normal low and flat tone. "We got caught with our pants down. The young guy had an ace up his sleeve." Ty Lee made a pouty face as she joked, "If I would have known pants would be getting let down." Azula snapped her fingers as Mai smiled slightly at her friend's juvenile humor. "Enough, both of you." "Ty Lee, what became of my brother and his comrades?" Smile disappearing, Ty Lee made a face that Azula rarely saw, one of grudging anger. "They got away. The prisoner you guys were fighting made it up to us. That's why I thought you both might have been hurt. I fought him before the Avatar's friend, the cute one, hit me when my back was turned. I took a spill, and by the time I was up again, the gondola was already on its way." She looked at Mai. "They had your uncle, but before I attacked, I overheard them saying they would leave him in the gondola station after they made it across." Mai nodded, a flash of relief crossing her face. Waving a hand dismissively, Azula turned away from the both of them and stepped away from the wall, and out under the furiously beaming sun. No matter that they escaped, their only path forward will be to either trek by land to the ocean or to make off with one of the airships in the northern airfield. With any luck, they just might lead us right to the Avatar. Mai stepped up behind her. I can get to organizing a pursuit party. Azula nodded. Do so. I want it to be small enough that we won't be easily detected when we are in pursuit. But make no mistake, I don't want Princess Azula. At a shout from across the courtyard, the three of them turned to see a high-ranking soldier running up to them. He had scorch marks on his armor and seemed to be limping slightly, but he nevertheless dipped into a deep bow as he stopped ahead of them. Your Highness, the prisoners are mostly rounded up and are being returned to their cells. The warden has been retrieved and has been found to be unharmed. He is taking the gondola back now. The extra divisions made restoring order relatively easy. Azula regarded him and smirked with satisfaction. I would expect no less of my father's hand-picked squads. She gestured over her right shoulder at Mai. I am having the warden's daughter organize a pursuit party of a small band of escaped prisoners, one of which happens to be my brother. Work with her to establish a team meeting my specifications, and I will take command of them immediately once that is finished. To her surprise, he didn't respond in the affirmative immediately, and instead, when she looked to him, she saw that his face was one of worry. She clarified, on the double, soldier. I'm sorry, Your Highness, it's just, we can out together a pursuit party of course, but... He reached behind him and revealed a scroll that had been tucked away. Handing it to her, he bowed his head. It's just that the Fire Lord has requested you return to the capital at once. Not daring to believe it, Azula tore open the scroll and read it over once, then again, and then again. But there was no mistaking the commanding verbiage her father had sent her. Whatever his reason, he needed her back at the capital at once, and though her soul was howling at her to hunt down the Avatar once and for all, this had to come first. It wasn't until Mai spoke up that she realized she had been standing there shaking angrily for quite a long moment. We'll accompany Her Highness back to the capital. Do you still have the Scorcher division on standby? Yes, ma'am. Have them take the lead on this. We'll depart as soon as the princess's airship is ready. The soldier bowed low again and strode away quickly to relay the orders. Mai looked after him, an annoyed tone in her voice. I hate when these assholes call me, ma'am. Ty Lee nuzzled up beside her, digging her elbow in Mai's side. That's what you get for looking like an old lady so young. She dodged a swipe from Mai and then slowly slid up to Azula. Hey, Zula, are you okay? It took Azula a few seconds more to ensure she would be able to speak in a level tone. Of course, I'll meet you two on the airship once I've spoken with the warden. She pretended not to see Mai and Ty Lee exchange concerned looks before the two of them departed for the airship. Azula waited until they were gone before igniting the scroll that had informed her of her summons home. It was quickly consumed in a sapphire blaze, and she crushed the remaining ashes in a fist before striding briskly towards the prison tower, loudly shouting a pair of guards out of her way. They're back, they're back. Ong shouted the words as he zipped by overhead on his glider, extenuating his good mood by doing a pair of tight loops around the pillars that made up the camp. Katara felt a flood of emotions wash through her veins as she leapt to her feet, hardly daring to believe it. It wasn't until Toph rushed by her and landed a stinging punch in her ribs that she finally moved and started with the rest of the group towards where she could see an airship coming in to land on a piece of the temple jutting out from the side of the mountain. Ouch, Toph. The blind earthbender waved a hand over her shoulder as her bare feet rushed her towards everyone's destination. Sorry, Katara, but you were the only one not moving for some reason. Just reminding you that your brother is back and still alive, and not dead and all that. Allowing herself to laugh at Toph's bizarre sense of humor and ways of showing affection, Katara followed her friend and the others up the steps, coming in to land next to her and join her in the rush to greet Sokka, and the rest. Ong looked over at her with a wildly happy look. You were right, Katara. I just had to trust them. She returned his smile and pulled him into a brief bear hug. You can still hit Sokka if you want. I think I still might myself. Ong laughed, a sound that never failed to make her heart swell. Don't go too hard on him. He's probably had a long couple days. On the constructed plateau that had left by airbenders long since passed, Katara came to a halt with the rest of her companions. Haru looked amazed, and Katara realized this was likely his first time getting a good look at an airship. I can't believe that thing can fly. Toph leaned over and gave Ong a similar punch she had just bestowed on Ong. Hey, I can't believe this doofus can fly either, but stranger things have happened. The airship touched down and the large lower basket opened. A collection of people exited the massive flying vehicle, but Katara only had eyes for two people. Pushing past her friends, she raced to Sokka and her father, half blinded by tears, and leapt into their arms. They hugged her back with similar intensity, and Katara found herself wishing she could feel this way forever. The relief and love racing through her heart were enough to send the tears flowing freely, but she found time to mutter with a voice that cracked, "Don't think you're out of the woods yet, Sokka." Her brother laughed. "How did I see that coming?" Her father kissed the top of her head and pulled away. A wide and joyous smile spread across his face. Sokka has quite the ingenuity about him, and certainly some truly hard-headed stubbornness. He reached out and pinched Katara's cheek. "I think you might be rubbing off on him." "Oh, stop it, Dad." Katara grinned as she pushed his arm aside playfully. As she clung to her family, Katara slowly found herself becoming aware of the rest of the passengers that had traveled back with Sokka and her father. She was thrilled to see Suki again, who didn't look that much the worse for wear, being stuck in prison for a great many weeks. Wrapping her arms around the warrior, she received assurances that Sokka had been the utmost gentleman while springing her from prison, taking out guards and all around making a mess of Boiling Rock. It was then Katara gave Sokka the first slap on the arm as she was reminded of the danger he had been in, before pulling him into another tight hug. "Girls," she heard him mutter as she turned back to the rest of the group. She also surprised herself by feeling great relief in seeing Zuko again, and that same surprise was echoed on his face as she pulled him into a hug of his own. She felt heartened to see him smiling as he gave Aang a rough hug, but there was a very distant look in his eyes, as though something were eating at him. Chit Sang was a new face, and one that Katara had to practically crane her head upwards when introduced. He was surely nice enough, but she was glad he was on their side. His size practically made her think that the plateau was about to drop away at his added weight alone. "Ah, and last but not least," Sokka intoned as he looked past Chit Sang, "we have. Hehe, I actually think I didn't catch your name, fellow prisoner." Chit Sang walked to the side to join the rest of the group, and Katara saw who her brother had been addressing. She couldn't help herself at being briefly struck by how attractive the newcomer was. He was younger, likely near her own age, though his face reflected a maturity of someone who had seen his fair share of hardship, something she often saw in her own reflection. Dark eyes and with an ever-present calm expression. He regarded them all flatly, and Katara found herself feeling naked under his gaze, rather as though he were sizing them all up like prey. His garb too was curious, as it was hardly something that a prisoner might wear, and it didn't remotely match the uniforms worn by Chit Sang, Suki, Zuko, and her father. The high-collared shirt, the blue cloth around his waist, and the lavender rope belt all struck her as particularly foreign, at least in regards to any of the garb she knew to be worn traditionally by any of the four nations. Katara noticed that he had turned his attention to a carving of a map on the wall that sported the majority of the relevant temples all across the four nations, as well as the nation capitals. He spoke to Sokka without turning away from the map, as though intent on committing it to memory. "You mentioned you had food." This was all he said, with a mature, low tone to match his look. Sokka's eyes widened as though he hadn't just been rather ignored. "Oh yeah, can someone get him a bag of grub?" Barely moving, Toph stomped her foot on the ground. A long strip of earth rose up between them and their camp a few dozen yards away, morphing into a slide of sorts that sloped downwards towards their camp before rising up with all the fluidity of a snake, sending a package of food gliding down its length to drop at Sokka's feet. The earth then dropped back down into the temple itself, and despite the dust that had been kicked up, it was though it had never moved at all. Sokka bent down, picked up the food and handed it to the stranger, who accepted the satchel after a moment, and slinging it over his shoulder. Katara noticed that his eyes never left Toph the entire time since she had displayed her earthbending, and she found herself inching protectively between the two of them. Smiling widely at the newcomer, Sokka spoke for him. "This guy is the reason we were able to make it out of there in one piece." He paused for a moment, looking actually rather displeased about something. "I don't know how we would have made it out without him. Azula, Mai and Ty Lee showed up at the prison just as the riot kicked off that we used as cover to escape. If all three of them had tried to stop us, I don't know what we would have been able to do." Katara cocked her head at him. "But," Sokka's smile returned, "but when this guy showed up, Azula and Mai went after him instead of us. From there, we were able to hold off Ty Lee until he shows up again. She goes to try and take him out, and I got a lucky shot on her with my boomerang." Suki slid up alongside him and interlaced her fingers with his. "It was hardly luck. Best throw I've ever seen." Sokka's cheeks reddened before he continued with a stutter. But I tagged her with the all boomerang, and that took her out long enough for us to get away." He looked at the stranger with a grateful smile. "We really owe it all to you, friend." The stranger said nothing more and simply stared at Sokka passively, who bit his upper lip and rocked on his heels awkwardly. After the unpleasant bout of silence that lasted for a brutal few long seconds, the stranger walked towards them. Haru and Ong moved out of his way as he started towards the path that led up the temple and back towards solid ground. Sokka took several steps after him, looking discouraged as he started up the stairs on the right that would take him out of the temple. Wait, I still had things I wanted to ask you. Stopping, the stranger tilted his head a few inches to the left to reply without turning around. I'm sorry, but I don't have any information that you would find prudent or useful. I can tell you the truth as best I know it. I woke up in the depths of that prison before I was able to escape during the riot. I don't remember hardly anything of my life before then, as though something took my memory. I'm not some rebel like you all. I have one commitment, and it is finding someone who might be able to help me find myself again. He paused before adding, my name is Sasuke, though I doubt that does you any good. Looking back forward, he started on again, leaving the group behind him in silence. Katara found herself rather relieved to be watching him leave. The vibes he had been giving off were mysterious and worrisome, and there was a part of her that had been wanting to demand that he leave. She found herself jolted back to reality as Ong bounced past her, running after the newcomer with his usual energy. Katara reached after him as he passed her, hissing angrily. Ong, wait. Either not hearing her, or choosing to ignore her, Ong ran up alongside Sasuke and gave him a large, friendly smile. It's great to meet you, Sasuke. Thanks for helping my friends. Sasuke stopped walking again, and his entire body language suggested he was fighting back some level of impatience. When he didn't reply, Ong continued on. I really think it might be best if you stay with us for a while, you know. It's not a good idea to be walking around the Fire Nation if you don't even know who you are, let alone much of anything else. Replying without looking at Ong, Sasuke adjusted the satchel of food he had slung over his shoulder. I'll make my own way, thanks anyway. Ong persisted jovially. Oh, come on. If you were locked up, then that must mean the Fire Nation has it out for you for one reason or another, and that means we're on the same side. I'm on no one's side, kid. Face scrunching up as though deciding whether or not to take offense at the kid remark, Ong seemed to choose to blow it off and instead forged on against the brick wall that was Sasuke. Well, we'd love to have you on ours. Maybe we can help you find yourself wherever you left him. Toph, Sokka, and the Duke all chuckled at the joke, but Sasuke seemed to tense up and Katara gently eased her hand towards her water vial. Ong extended a hand towards him. I'm Ong. Sasuke didn't move, nor look at him, and Ong gave a long sigh, though his smile remained. Look, I can tell you're not one for making friends or really just talking in general. But I have to be honest with you, I really need all the help I can get right now. If you were really able to fight Azula and Mai at the same time and come away on top, we need that kind of power on our side. He looked back to the rest of them as if for encouragement. Katara tried to make a motion to indicate he move away from Sasuke, but he missed it. It's too dangerous for you to be out there on your own, even if you're really strong. And when we take down the Fire Lord, I promise we'll be able to help you figure out your memory full time. It'll be hard enough trying to solve that one your own and with the 4 nations at war. And we even have a flying bison. There was another pause before Sasuke replied flatly, genuinely sounding like a parent trying to explain terribly simple to a child. Ong, I appreciate what you're saying, but I don't have time to go attempting half-baked coups against Fire Lords. Not when I already know who has the best chance of beating him. So thanks, but no thanks. And he continued his walk up the stairs again. Ong looked at the ground, furrowing his brow. Dang, I really thought the flying bison line would work. Something Sasuke had said had stuck with Katara, however, and she called after him. You said you know who has the best chance of taking down the Fire Lord. He nodded without ceasing to walk. Zuko stepped up next to Katara and added after him. Who, then? Sasuke replied flatly, the Avatar. I'm going to find him and help him defeat the Fire Lord. Katara found herself exchanging glances with Ong, Sokka, Zuko, and just about everyone else standing in their group. Did he truly not know a thing about the state of the world? But before she could stop him, Ong had called out in a triumphant tone. Well, you happen to be in luck. We've got him on our team. This caused Sasuke to stop walking and he turned to give Ong a challenging look. Oh, and where might he be? Katara's heart skipped a beat as she implored Ong not to answer, but of course, he did. You're looking at him. He put his hands on his hips and gave Sasuke a last great big smile. Sasuke stared at him for a long time and Katara waited for him to either laugh off the claim or to simply turn around and continue on his way out. Moving so fast, it was as though he had been standing there the entire time. Sasuke was on top of Ong and had lifted him off the ground by the collar of his shirt. Katara moved as quickly as she could and within a second, several thin spears of ice were pointed at Sasuke's head. Zuko whipped up several flaming coils around Sasuke's throat and ankles and Toph threw up a hammer of stone that hovered just behind Sasuke's back. The three of them stood tense with their arms outstretched, ready to bring their elements crashing down on Sasuke. But he hadn't seemed to notice their display. His eyes were fixed on Aang's as he spoke in a low, final tone. You, or the Avatar. Aang was still smiling, though he had picked up much more on the fire, ice and earth that were all poised to turn Sasuke into a smear on the temple floor, and was looking markedly more nervous. Hehe, yeah, that's me. You're the great warrior who I was told will be the one to defeat the Fire Lord. Well, I wouldn't call myself a great warrior per se, but I guess. Sasuke released Aang, who dropped several inches to step back from him. He turned towards Katara and the others, waving his hands desperately. Guys, it's all good. Let him go. Toph spoke for all of them. I'm not so sure about that, Twinkle Toes. I'm not exactly digging how this guy feels. Katara jerked her chin at Aang without taking her eyes off Sasuke. Step away from him, Aang. Turning his head as much as he could with Zuko's fire circling his throat, Sasuke fixed his eyes directly on Katara, and she felt a chill run up her spine. Yet, he suddenly was no longer standing where she had last seen him, and a splash of water dropped down onto the stairs where his body had been just a second before. That crap out of my face. Katara gave a yell as she spun to see that he was now somehow standing behind them, but she collected herself quickly. Together with Zuko and Toph, they directed their powers towards him. Zuko's fire reached him first, but with a quick hand motion from Sasuke, the fire was reduced to a puff of smoke. Katara's spears of ice reached him next, aimed at his head and joints, but he motioned again and the ice burst into a cold spray of wind that rushed gently past him. Then Toph's great hammer of earth rose up and swung down towards his head, but his hand made two quick symbols and then shot up, pointer and middle finger outstretched. As soon as they touched the earth, it blew apart into rubble, tossed every direction, but missing Sasuke entirely. Giving a yell of frustration, Katara gathered up her energy and drew from the basin beneath them. All at once, a great wave had gathered all around Sasuke, ready to rush in and crush him beneath its weight. She heard herself call out as the roar of the water swirled around him. Guys, get ready. But no earth or fire or air coalesced into an offensive state, and she shouted again. Guys, come on, if we. Toph's small hand reached out then and took her by the wrist. Looking down, Katara saw that the girl's face was alight with an expression she had never seen before, awe. Beside her, Zuko's eyes were wide and his fists were tightly clenched. It was then that Aang walked alongside her, utter disbelief on his face. Katara, he is like me. And as the realization struck her, Katara lost grip on the water and it fell down around the precipice that Sasuke stood on down into the massive canyon. Her knees wobbled and she saw Sasuke staring at them with intensity and readiness, but now with a fair bit of confusion. Aang whispered, his voice breaking with astoundment. He can bend more than one element. On the helm of her airship, Azula tried to reason out her infuriation. She had no doubt that Mai and Ty Lee were watching her from one of the bridge's windows, keeping a watchful eye on her state of being, but she couldn't be bothered to care what they thought right then. Father, why? It hardly made sense why he would be calling her back, after being the one to send her to Boiling Rock in the first place. The Avatar was close, and Azula could have been the one to finally bring him in. But now here she was being summoned home to be denied victory again. It was hours before she realized that this wasn't why she was so agitated. The words that had been written on the scroll echoed mercilessly in her head. As my loyal servant, I must ask that you return to me in the capital at once. Servant, servant, he had written. Of course, she was his to command as he wanted, to do with what he pleased, but would it have been so difficult for him to acknowledge her as more than a tool? She wasn't Zuko or Iroh, some embarrassment to the family. Quite the contrary, she had led many a military success, and had never left her father's good graces. So why is it so much to ask to be recognized as such? Shaking herself free of her thoughts, Azula cursed her own foolishness. She was making this into a far bigger deal than it needed to be. Of course her father appreciated her more than his writing might indicate, and it wasn't her place to question it regardless. She would go to him, kneel at his feet and ask for his bidding. It was her purpose after all. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 2. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author Blutus Mindpretzel on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.